In 2004, biologists stumbled into a hidden cave. Inside, they found a family that vanished 14 years earlier. The discovery happened quietly, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in late September. Two biologists, Ben Carter and Lisa Hansen, were in the less-traveled northern sector of Big Pine National Park, tracking elk migration patterns. It was their third day out, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, the forest floor a carpet of fallen pine needles and damp earth. They were focused on their GPS units and scat samples, not expecting anything more than the usual signs of wildlife. The park was vast, ancient, and held many small secrets, but this one had been buried deeper than most. They walked, noting the way the elk seemed to avoid a certain dense thicket, pushing through shoulder-high ferns that hadn't been disturbed in years. Ben paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Something felt off about the air here, a stillness that was different from the usual forest quiet. He scanned the dense undergrowth. Was that a shadow or an opening? He pushed aside a curtain of old man's beard hanging from a low branch. Beyond it, the ground dipped sharply, almost unnaturally. It wasn't a sinkhole, more like a collapsed section of earth, half hidden by a tangle of roots and fallen logs. Curiosity, a trait essential for their line of work, tugged at them. Lisa, ever the cautious one, said, "Maybe we should mark it and report it." But Ben was already peering closer. "There's a space," he said, "like a small opening at the bottom." It looked like an animal den, perhaps, but larger, and the earth around it seemed disturbed, yet settled, as if the collapse had happened long ago. What could have made such a thing? The ground here was mostly granite, solid. A tremor? Unlikely. None had been recorded strong enough in decades. They carried powerful flashlights for navigating dense woods at dusk, and Ben clicked his on, aiming the beam into the narrow fissure. The light didn't immediately hit a back wall. Instead, it seemed to be swallowed by a deeper darkness. "Strange," he muttered, mostly to himself. Lisa came closer, her own flashlight joining his. The twin beams cut a slightly wider path, revealing not just a den, but what looked like a narrow passage sloping downwards. An old mining prospect, maybe? The park had a few, long abandoned and sealed, but this showed no signs of tools, no shored-up timbers, just raw earth and rock. Yet there was something about the way the rocks had fallen, a chaotic jumble that suggested a sudden, violent event, not slow erosion. Was it safe? Probably not. Were they going in? The unspoken question hung in the cool air. The pull of the unknown was strong. "Just a quick look," Ben said, his voice a little too casual. "We won't go far." Lisa hesitated, then nodded. The mystery was too compelling to ignore. They had to know what lay beyond that tight opening. What could be hidden so completely, for so long, in a national park visited by thousands each year? The first few feet were a tight squeeze, loose soil and small stones skittering under their boots. Then the passage opened slightly. The air grew colder, and a damp, earthy smell filled their nostrils. The scent of a place untouched by sun or wind for a very long time. Ben's light caught something a dozen feet ahead. Not rock, not earth. Something smooth, with a strange dull gleam. "What in the world is that?" he breathed. The smooth, gleaming object was the first sign that this was no ordinary hole in the ground. It was a piece of metal, rusted but recognizable, the side of a portable camping stove. Their flashlights darted around, picking out other shapes in the gloom. A tattered piece of fabric, possibly a backpack, lay half buried in the dust. And then, Lisa's light fell on the cave wall to their right. She gasped, a small, choked sound. Ben swung his beam to follow hers. On the relatively flat surface of the rock, illuminated in the stark white light, were drawings, childlike stick figures, a smiling sun, a lopsided house with smoke curling from its chimney. They were faint, smudged by time and damp, but undeniably made by human hands, children's hands. A cold dread began to seep into Ben, far colder than the cave air. This wasn't an animal den. This wasn't an old prospector's hideout. This was something else, something terrible. What had happened here? And who had made these drawings in the suffocating dark? The silence of the cave pressed in on them, heavy and absolute, broken only by their own ragged breaths. They took another step forward, deeper into the chamber, drawn by a horrifying fascination. The beam of Ben's flashlight swept across the floor, and then it stopped. Stopped on a shape that made his heart pound in his chest, a shape that was unmistakably human. 14 years earlier, in the bright summer of 1990, the Peterson family had been full of excitement. John Peterson, a high school history teacher with a love for the outdoors, his wife Sarah, a kind-faced nurse who packed the best picnic lunches, and their 3 children, 12-year-old Mark, quiet and observant like his father, 9-year-old Emily, all bright smiles and boundless energy, and little Leo, just 6, who clutched his favorite stuffed bear, Barnaby, as if it were a lifeline to adventure. Their annual camping trip to Big Pine National Park was a cherished tradition, a week away from city life, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. This year, John had promised them a hike to Echo Falls, a place spoken of in hushed, almost reverent tones by other campers. Known for its stunning beauty and the way your voice would bounce back from the canyon walls. They packed their old station wagon with a practiced efficiency, tent, sleeping bags, cooler filled with food, John's guitar for campfire songs, and a new camera Sarah had bought to capture the memories. The drive was filled with the usual backseat squabbles and sing-alongs, the anticipation building with every mile that brought them closer to the towering pines and granite peaks of the park. They checked in at the ranger station on a sunny Friday morning. John, spreading a map on the counter, pointed out their intended campsite and their planned day hike to Echo Falls for the next day. The ranger, a seasoned man named Henderson, with a weathered face and kind eyes, nodded. "Good choice," he'd said. "It's a bit of a climb, but worth it. Just watch the weather. It can turn fast in the high country." John assured him they were experienced and would be careful. Sarah took a photo of the children standing by the park entrance sign, Leo still hugging Barnaby, Emily making a funny face, Mark trying to look serious and grown up. It would be the last photograph ever taken of them. They set up their camp in a designated spot by a clear, rushing stream. The first evening was idyllic. A crackling campfire, roasted hot dogs, John playing old folk songs on his guitar as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, brighter and more numerous than they ever saw in the city. The children were tired but happy, snuggling into their sleeping bags with promises of the waterfall adventure the next day. What could possibly go wrong in such a peaceful place? On Saturday morning, they set off early for Echo Falls. They left their main campsite intact, planning to return by late afternoon. They carried a day pack with water, sandwiches, a first aid kit, and Sarah's new camera. The trail was well marked at first, winding through ancient forests, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Emily skipped ahead, pointing out wildflowers, while Mark walked beside his father, asking questions about the trees and rocks. Leo, holding Sarah's hand, chattered about the squirrels and birds. They were a picture of a happy family, immersed in the beauty of the wilderness, completely unaware of the invisible thread of fate tightening around them. They were last seen by another pair of hikers around mid-morning, already on the Echo Falls Trail, reportedly in good spirits and making good time. Those hikers continued on their own route, expecting the Petersons would reach the falls and return, just as thousands had done before. But the Petersons never made it back to their campsite that evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, the campfire remained unlit, and the forest grew quiet around their empty tent. The only sound was the rushing stream, oblivious to the family that was supposed to be sleeping beside it. Where had they gone? The question, whispered first by a concerned neighboring camper who noticed their prolonged absence, would soon echo through the entire park. The alarm was officially raised the next morning, Sunday. The neighboring camper, a retired firefighter named Al, had a bad feeling. He'd seen the family leave, cheerful and prepared, but their continued absence, the untouched tent, the cold fire pit, it wasn't right. He alerted the ranger station. Park Ranger Henderson, the same man who had checked them in, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen it before. Hikers underestimating the wilderness, taking a wrong turn, getting caught out by bad weather or injury. But a whole family of 5? That was rare and deeply troubling. The initial search began almost immediately. Henderson and 2 other rangers drove to the Echo Falls trailhead, their faces grim. The Peterson station wagon was still there, locked and undisturbed. A bad sign. It meant they hadn't come back to their car for any reason. They were out there, somewhere in the vast, rugged backcountry. The search teams fanned out along the Echo Falls Trail and the immediate surrounding areas. Volunteers from nearby towns, local hiking clubs, even a few off-duty military personnel joined the effort. They called out the families' names: John, Sarah, Mark, Emily, Leo. Their voices were swallowed by the immense silence of the forest, the echoes from the canyon walls returning mockingly empty. Hopes were initially high. Surely they couldn't have gone far off the trail. Perhaps one of them had twisted an ankle and they were waiting for help. The first day yielded few clues. They found a brightly colored hair tie, identified by Al as similar to one the little girl, Emily, had been wearing. It was a few feet off the main path, near a rocky outcrop. Had she dropped it while scrambling, or was it a sign of something more? Then, further up, near a creek crossing, a ranger found a discarded candy wrapper, the brand one John Peterson was known to favor. But these were small things, easily lost, and after that, the trail of clues went cold. There were no footprints where they expected them, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle or a camp. It was as if the forest had simply absorbed them. Then, on the 3rd day of the search, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in over the peaks, and a sudden, violent summer thunderstorm unleashed its fury on the park. Torrential rain lashed the mountainside, turning gentle streams into raging torrents, washing away any potential tracks or scents. The search had to be suspended for nearly 24 hours. The teams forced to take shelter, frustrated and increasingly anxious. When they resumed, the ground was a muddy mess, the landscape altered. The window for finding the family alive and well was closing rapidly. Days turned into a week. The media descended on Big Pine, their vans clogging the narrow park roads, their cameras and microphones thrust at anyone in a ranger uniform. The story of the missing family captivated and horrified the nation. Theories abounded. An animal attack? Possible. The park had bears and mountain lions, but there was no evidence. No torn clothing, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Did they simply get lost, wander off trail, and succumb to the elements? It was a large park, easy to get disoriented if you weren't careful. Or was it something more sinister? Foul play? No ransom note had appeared. No suspects emerged. The forest held its secrets tightly. After 2 agonizing weeks, with every square mile of the primary search area covered multiple times, the official search was scaled back. Small teams continued to patrol for another month. but hope was fading. The Petersons were gone. A heavy cloud of grief and unanswered questions settled over Big Pine National Park, a shadow that would linger for years to come. What really happened to them on that sunny Saturday? The years that followed were cold ones for the memory of the Peterson family. The case file, initially thick with reports, maps, and interview transcripts, gradually gathered dust on a shelf in the county sheriff's office. Anniversaries of their disappearance would bring a brief flurry of local news interest, a re-airing of their last known photo, a renewed plea for any information, however small. But no new leads ever surfaced. The forest, it seemed, had swallowed them whole, leaving not a trace behind. Distant relatives, a sister of Sarah's in another state, an elderly uncle of John's, held out a fragile hope for a miracle. But as time wore on, even that began to erode, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of unknowing. What was worse, knowing they were gone, or never knowing how, why, or where. The park itself continued to change. Nature is relentless in its cycles of growth and decay. Old trails, less frequented, became overgrown. New paths were blazed in other areas to accommodate the ever-present tourists. Some sections of the park, deemed too rugged or unstable, were quietly allowed to return to their wild state. Rangers retired. New ones took their place, many of whom only knew the Peterson disappearance as a story. A cautionary tale whispered to new recruits about the unforgiving nature of the wilderness they patrolled. The specific area where the biologists would eventually find the cave was not on any of the primary search maps from 1990. It was considered off-trail, difficult terrain, a steep slope choked with rocks and dense brush. It was thought unlikely that a family with young children would have ventured there. And even if they had, the rockslide that sealed their fate likely occurred after the initial intense search period had passed in that broader zone. Or perhaps it was so localized, so hidden by the existing topography, that searchers passing nearby would have seen nothing amiss, just another jumble of rocks on a wild mountainside. How could anyone have known that beneath that unremarkable slope, a terrible drama was unfolding, then falling silent? The story of the Petersons became a kind of local legend, a ghost story almost. Parents would warn their children to stick to the trails, invoking the memory of the family who vanished. For the community around Big Pine, it was an open wound, a mystery that pricked at the collective conscience. Other incidents happened in the park over the 14 years: a hiker with a broken leg, a lost child found quickly, a minor wildfire. But the Peterson case remained unique in its completeness, its utter lack of resolution. It was as if a door had opened, they had stepped through, and the door had closed silently and invisibly behind them. The forest kept its secrets locked away, buried under layers of seasons, fallen leaves, and fading memories. Until that September day, in 2004, when Ben Carter and Lisa Hansen decided to investigate a strange depression in the ground. 14 years. An entire childhood for some. A lifetime of grief for others. And all that time, the forest held its breath, waiting. Ben Carter and Lisa Hansen stood frozen at the threshold of the inner chamber, their flashlight beams crisscrossing in the suffocating darkness. The air was heavy, still, carrying a faint, musty odor mixed with something else, something unsettlingly organic. After the initial shock of seeing the children's drawings, they had pushed forward, compelled by a grim necessity to understand what they had found. Their names, Ben and Lisa, felt small and insignificant in this vast, silent tomb. They were biologists, trained to observe, to document, but nothing could have prepared them for this. The cave was not large, perhaps 20 feet across and 30 feet deep, the ceiling low enough for Ben, who was tall, to almost touch if he stretched. The passage they'd entered through, was clearly a collapse, a jumble of rocks and earth that sealed off what might have once been a wider opening to the outside world. Their lights swept the interior. The rusted camping stove was near one wall. Next to it, a dented metal cookpot. A few tin cans, their labels long gone, lay scattered. Then they saw the sleeping bags. 3 of them, arranged side by side, as if their occupants had simply lain down to rest. A smaller, child-sized bag was a little apart, near one of the walls with the drawings. The fabric was decayed, discolored, but the shapes were unmistakable. Lisa let out a soft cry, covering her mouth with her hand. Ben felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just an old campsite. This was a grave. His light moved slowly, methodically. Near the largest sleeping bag, what would have been the father's, lay a pair of sturdy hiking boots, laces still tied. A small, leather-bound book, like a diary, was tucked beside them. In another corner, a small faded object caught Lisa's eye. She moved closer, her light trembling. It was a teddy bear, its fur matted and discolored, one button eye missing. Barnaby. The name flashed in Ben's mind from some old newspaper clipping he'd vaguely remembered seeing years ago. The Peterson family. The missing family. It had to be them. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. They had been found. After all these years, they had been found. Here, trapped. The children's drawings on the wall took on a new, heartbreaking poignancy. They weren't just idle scribbles. They were a desperate attempt to bring light and hope into this terrible darkness, a memory of the world they had lost. Ben and Lisa looked at each other, their faces pale in the reflected glow of their flashlights. The silence in the cave was immense, a silence that had lasted for 14 years. They knew they couldn't touch anything. This was a scene that needed to be handled by professionals, by the authorities. "We need to get out," Ben said, his voice hoarse. "We need to call someone." Lisa nodded, unable to speak. They began to back away slowly, careful not to disturb anything further. The weight of their discovery pressed down on them, the tragedy of it almost unbearable. They had stumbled upon the end of a story of a family's hope turning to despair in the cold, unyielding earth. As they reached the narrow passage leading out, Ben's flashlight beam caught one last detail on the far wall, near the jumble of rocks that blocked any hope of escape. Scratches. Deep, desperate scratches in the stone, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. And then, just as he was about to turn and squeeze back through the opening to the sunlit world above, his light fell on something else, something he'd missed before. Tucked into a crevice near where the father's boots lay, it was a small, worn, leather-bound journal. His hand, almost of its own volition, reached out. What secrets did its fragile pages hold? What last words were written in the dark? The climb out of the cave was more difficult than the entry, burdened as they were by the enormity of what they had seen. Emerging into the dappled sunlight of the forest felt like being reborn, yet the images from the darkness were seared into their minds. The call to the park authorities, then to the county sheriff, was made with trembling hands and choked voices. The news spread quickly, quietly at first, then with gathering force. This was not just any discovery. This was the answer to a question that had haunted the region for over a decade. Within hours, the remote area was cordoned off. The sheriff, a man named Henderson, ironically the son of the ranger who had overseen the initial search in 1990, arrived with a grim-faced team. Forensic specialists, archaeologists accustomed to delicate recovery, even a geologist to assess the stability of the cave. They all converged on the site. The work was slow, methodical, and somber. Every item was photographed, catalogued, and carefully removed. The rusted stove, the dented pot, the scattered cans, the tattered remnants of sleeping bags. And then, the human remains. 5 individuals. The sizes, the apparent ages, consistent with the Peterson family. Dental records, painstakingly compared with old family dentist charts, would later provide definitive confirmation. The personal items were the hardest to handle. A small, tarnished silver locket, found near where Sarah Peterson would have lain, its clasp broken. Inside, too faded to see clearly, would have been tiny pictures of her children, Mark's worn pocket knife, a gift from his grandfather, Emily's brightly colored plastic beads from a broken necklace scattered like fallen tears in the dust, and Leo's bear, Barnaby, carefully bagged as if it were the most precious artifact on earth. Each object was a whisper from the past, a poignant reminder of lives cut short, of laughter silenced. The media descended again, just as they had 14 years earlier, but this time the tone was different. Not the frantic speculation of an active search, but the somber reporting of a tragedy, finally understood. The old wounds were reopened for those who remembered the family, for the community that had never quite given up a sliver of hope. The journal Ben had spotted was treated with extreme care. Its leather cover was stiff, the pages brittle and fused in places from dampness and time. Specialists would be needed to separate them, to preserve whatever ink might still cling to the fragile paper. What horrors, what perseverance, what final thoughts were contained within those silent pages. The first page the specialists managed to uncurl and read, days later, sent a shiver down the spine of the lead investigator, Detective Miller. The handwriting was clear, though a little shaky. The date was August 17, 1990. 2 days after the Petersons had been officially reported missing. The entry began with 5 chilling words. The rocks fell. We are trapped. Detective Miller, a veteran with tired eyes who had been a rookie deputy back in 1990, felt a personal weight settle upon him as he oversaw the investigation into the journal's contents. He remembered the Peterson case vividly. It had been one of the first major unsolved incidents of his early career. Now, it was as if the father, John Peterson, was speaking directly to him across the span of 14 years. The fragile pages of the journal were painstakingly separated and photographed in a specialized lab. The ink, a common blue, had faded but was mostly legible, at least in the earlier entries. John Peterson's handwriting, usually neat and precise according to samples from his teaching notes, started strong, documenting their horrifying predicament with a teacher's clarity. The first entry described the moment of disaster. They had been exploring a shallow rock overhang, a sort of small cave, to get out of a sudden, intense downpour that had started while they were on the Echo Falls Trail. It wasn't on any map, just a recess in the mountainside. The children had been delighted, thinking it an adventure. Then, a terrifying rumble. The ground shook. Before they could react, a section of the cliff face above the overhang gave way. A torrent of rocks, earth, and debris crashed down, completely sealing the entrance, plunging them into absolute darkness. John wrote of the immediate aftermath: the dust, the children's terrified screams, Sarah's attempts to soothe them, his own fear quickly suppressed. He checked everyone for injuries. Miraculously, aside from scrapes and bruises, they were physically unharmed. But they were entombed. His first actions were practical. He took stock of their supplies: 6 sandwiches, a bag of apples, 3 chocolate bars, and, most critically, only 1 full canteen of water. Their main backpacks with more food and water purification tablets were back at the main campsite, miles away. He tried shouting for help, his voice hoarse from the effort, but only a dead, flat silence answered. The rockfall was too thick, too deep. He explored their prison. The cave was small, a single chamber, with no other discernible exit. The air was breathable but rapidly growing stale. He wrote of the children. Mark, trying to be brave but his fear evident in his wide eyes. Emily, crying quietly, asking when they could go home. Leo, clinging to Sarah, asking for Barnaby, who had, by some small mercy, been in Emily's small daypack they'd carried into the shelter. Sarah, John wrote, was his rock, her calm presence a balm to the children's terror, though he could see the fear in her own eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The journal detailed John's initial plans. Strict rationing of food and water. He would try to dig them out. He had his pocket knife, and there were some loose rocks he thought he might be able to dislodge. He had to maintain hope for Sarah, for the children. He encouraged them to talk, to sing songs, anything to ward off the encroaching despair. It was Sarah's idea for the children to draw on a relatively smooth section of the cave wall, using small, sharp stones they found. They drew their house, the sun, their dog Max, waiting for them at home, fleeting images of a life that now seemed a distant dream. Each drawing was a small act of defiance against the crushing darkness. A few days into their ordeal, John wrote of a small, steady drip of water they discovered in a far corner of the cave. It was a lifeline, however meager. They used the dented cookpot to collect it, drop by precious drop, but his attempts to move the larger rocks at the entrance were proving futile. They were too heavy, too deeply wedged. His hands were raw and bleeding. The hope he so desperately clung to was beginning to fray. A later entry, the handwriting now less steady, read, "Water nearly gone from the canteen. Leo is coughing a lot. The collected drips are not enough. Sarah is worried. I told her I will move those rocks. I must." The silence of the cave was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the sound of John Peterson's desperate, weakening efforts against unyielding stone. The journal entries grew shorter, more sporadic, as the days, or what they perceived as days, in the timeless dark, wore on. John Peterson's account became a harrowing testament to a father's love and a family's struggle against an uncaring fate. He wrote of his attempts to dig, using a sharpened piece of metal pried from the camping stove after his knife blade snapped. He described the agonizing slowness, the back-breaking labor, the sickening feeling each time a larger rock refused to budge. His muscles ached. His hands were torn and infected. The tiny pile of displaced rubble seemed to mock his efforts. Sarah, he wrote, was fading. She spent most of her time holding the children, whispering stories, humming lullabies. Her strength was ebbing, but her love remained a fierce, protective shield. The children were weak, listless. The drawings on the wall stopped. One of the last images depicted was a small stick-figure family, holding hands, standing beneath a tiny, distant sun that had a sad, downturned mouth. Another, more chaotic, showed what looked like a monster made of jagged rocks, its maw open. The scant food had run out long ago. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Thirst was a torment. John wrote of hallucinations, of seeing sunlight, hearing rescuers' voices, only to have them dissolve back into the oppressive blackness. He tried to keep track of time by the rhythm of their hunger and sleep, but the days blurred into an indistinguishable agony. Lost count of days, one entry read. Emily asked for an apple. I had nothing to give her, Sarah cried. I held them. So cold now. The entries became increasingly difficult to decipher, the handwriting faint and erratic, a reflection of his own dwindling strength. He wrote of his love for Sarah, his pride in his children, his profound regret for leading them into this trap. He asked for forgiveness, though it wasn't clear from whom, from them, from God, from himself. The forensic reports, when they came back, corroborated the grim timeline suggested by the journal. Based on the state of the remains and the environmental conditions in the cave, the medical examiner estimated they had survived for at least 2 weeks, possibly closer to 3, after the rockslide. 3 weeks of darkness, of dwindling hope, of slow starvation and dehydration. The horror of their prolonged suffering was almost unimaginable. One of the final legible entries in John Peterson's journal was just a few words, scrawled weakly across the page. "Sarah, quiet now. Children, too. Can barely hold pen. So cold." Then a single final word, almost illegible, written with the last ounce of his strength: "Forgive." The official findings brought a somber closure to the 14-year mystery. Cause of death for all 5 members of the Peterson family: exposure, dehydration, and starvation, resulting from entrapment due to a rockslide. There was no foul play, no mysterious attacker, just a tragic accident of geology and timing, a cruel twist of fate in a wild place. The news brought a strange mix of relief and profound sadness to the community and to the few distant relatives who remained. The not knowing was over, but the reality of their end was brutal. So many what-ifs hung in the air. What if they hadn't sought shelter in that specific spot? What if the rockslide had happened an hour later, or an hour earlier? What if the search teams in 1990 had somehow, against all odds, found that hidden fissure? But such questions were futile, offering no comfort, only deepening the sense of tragedy. The Park Service reviewed its maps and geological surveys of the area, but the cave had been utterly concealed, the entrance buried under tons of rock and decades of overgrowth. It was a freak occurrence, impossible to predict or prevent. A quiet, private funeral service was held for the Peterson family. Their remains were interred together in a small cemetery in the town where John and Sarah had grown up, far from the mountains that had claimed them. The story of their ordeal, pieced together from the journal and the silent evidence of the cave, became a solemn reminder of the fragility of life and the immense, indifferent power of nature. The images from the cave, the rusted stove, a symbol of their futile attempts to sustain life, the children's drawings on the cold stone, a testament to their enduring spirit and innocence. Leo's bear, Barnaby, a tiny emblem of lost childhood, these became etched in the public memory. The journal itself, John Peterson's last testament, spoke of unimaginable suffering, but also of unwavering love and a desperate fight for survival. His final, scrawled "Forgive me," resonated with a heartbreaking poignancy. He had done everything a father could do, against impossible odds. The cave was eventually sealed permanently and thoroughly by park authorities, not out of a desire to hide the tragedy, but to protect the site from disturbance, to let the mountain reclaim its own in peace. A small, discreet plaque was placed on a rock face along the Echo Falls Trail, miles away from the actual location, simply stating the names of the Peterson family and the year they were lost and found, a quiet acknowledgement of their story within the vastness of Big Pine National Park. The forest would continue its cycles, the seasons would turn, and the specific spot where the family had met their end would once again be hidden, absorbed back into the wilderness. But the silence there was different now. It was a silence filled with the echoes of a family's final days, a story of love and loss written in the heart of the ancient stone. The darkness had held them for 14 years, but in the end, their story came to light, a tragic, unforgettable whisper from the earth. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.